Using both the original Chinese text and Lionel Giles' classic 1910 English translation, we'll explore the art of war chapter by chapter, not just what Sun Tzu wrote, but what he meant. Welcome to The Way and the War. In the previous episode, we finished the first chapter of The Art of War, Laying Plans. When we put everything in that chapter together, Sun Tzu is essentially telling us that before a war begins, there are three things we need to do. First, understand war. War can determine the survival or destruction of a state. So before anything else, we need to understand the nature of war, its fundamental principles, and the basic rules that govern it. Why war must be approached with extreme caution, and how Sun Tzu believes advantage should be created. Second, assess the war. Through the 5 factors, the 7 strategic comparisons, and the calculations made before war, we systematically compare ourselves, our opponent, and the conditions surrounding the conflict. This is also where the idea that later becomes know the enemy and know yourself begins to take shape. Who has the advantage? Where does that advantage come from? Where are the weaknesses? And ultimately, is this war worth fighting at all? Third, shape the war. Based on the first 2 steps, we use Gui, Shi, and the principle of adapting our actions according to advantage to create favorable conditions, seize the strategic initiative, and establish the overall direction of the war. Put simply, laying plans answers 4 fundamental questions. Why are we fighting this war? Should we fight it? What gives us a reason to believe we can win? And what should our overall approach to victory be? But even if we have answered all of these questions, there is still one very practical problem. Once the war actually begins, can you afford the cost? That is the subject of the second chapter of The Art of War, Waging War. If laying plans is about creating the conditions for victory before the war begins, then waging war is about what happens once the machinery of war is actually set in motion. What does victory cost? And how do you deal with that cost? So the core of waging war revolves around 2 things: economics and logistics. Among all the surviving works of military theory we know today, The Art of War is the earliest to explicitly incorporate economics into the study of warfare. And Sun Tzu places the subject remarkably early in the book. That alone shows just how far ahead of his time his thinking was. But why does war have such an enormous impact on the economy? We can see it clearly in the current war between the United States and Iran. Since the war began, it has triggered major disruptions to global energy markets and transportation. Fuel prices around the world have risen sharply. Over the past 12 months, energy prices in the United States have increased by 14.7% overall, while fuel oil used for home heating and industrial purposes has surged by 39.1%. US airline fares have risen 25.5% year over year, putting enormous pressure on low-cost airlines such as Spirit Airlines, forcing them to shut down routes or suspend operations. Ports around the world have become congested. Supply chains have been disrupted. Prices have risen, pushing up the cost of living for ordinary people. In the United States, food and beverage prices have increased by around 3 to 3.4% year over year, with fruit and vegetable prices rising by 5.1%. And although overall CPI fell to 3.4% in July, down from its 4.2% peak in May, the statistics agency specifically noted that prices are still rising faster than average wages. In other words, people's real purchasing power and ultimately their standard of living is being gradually eroded. Modern warfare can already have an enormous impact on the economy and on the everyday lives of ordinary people. Now imagine warfare in the ancient world, when almost everything had to be produced by human labor, and almost everything had to be transported by human or animal power. The burden that war placed on both the state and its people would have been immense. That is why roughly 60% of waging war is devoted to the economic consequences of warfare. And if we want to fully understand Sun Tzu's logic in this chapter, we cannot simply read each passage in isolation. We need to take the chapter apart and then reconstruct the logic behind it. Here is how I would reorganize its structure. Sun Tzu begins by explaining the economic burden of mobilizing an army before it even goes to war. He then moves to what happens after the army has been deployed and how the logistics required to sustain that army place even more pressure on the economy. Next, he brings these two sides together and once again emphasizes the broader impact of war on the economy and on the lives of ordinary people. From there, he explains what can happen to a state when the economic pressure created by war becomes too severe. Then, Sun Tzu offers two solutions to the problem and explains the logic behind each of them. Finally, after examining both approaches, he makes clear which one he considers the better solution. Now, let's go through this step by step. Sun Tzu said, "Pause to read." This is the opening passage of Waging War. And here, Sun Tzu is describing the economic burden a state must bear before its army can even be sent into the field. To wage a war, a state has to mobilize soldiers, assemble weapons and equipment, gather enormous quantities of supplies, and organize the logistics needed to move and sustain the army. All of this costs money. Because the cost of an army does not begin when the fighting begins. Simply keeping an army alive and functioning every single day requires enormous resources. Food, equipment, transportation, maintenance, animals, manpower, and countless other supplies all have to be provided continuously. In fact, the cost of simply sustaining an army may be even greater than the cost of maintaining its ability to fight. And if a state cannot afford these costs, it cannot put an army into the field in the first place. Sun Tzu then writes, "Pause to read." Here, Sun Tzu moves to what happens after the army has been deployed and how logistics begin to affect the economy. Keeping an army supplied is essential, but there is a fundamental problem. An army can only carry so much with it. Animals can only transport a limited amount of supplies, and an individual soldier can carry even less. If soldiers carry too much food, the extra weight slows down the march. If you use more animals to transport that food, those animals also need to be fed. And the more animals you add, the more additional food you need to carry just to sustain the transportation system itself. The problem keeps compounding. Before the invention of the steam engine and the railway, this logistical limitation was extremely difficult to overcome. So an army needed a continuous supply line, connecting it to the resources behind the front. But maintaining that supply line required enormous amounts of labor. And the people transporting those supplies also had to eat. More importantly, many of these people would normally have been working in agriculture. Once war pulled them away from production and into military logistics, the number of people actually producing food began to fall. So one of the first major consequences of war was the disruption of normal economic and social activity. At the same time, the enormous demand for food created by the army and its logistics system pushed prices upward. And as long as the war continued, these pressures continued with it. If they lasted long enough, both the state and its people could eventually be driven toward financial exhaustion. Sun Tzu continues. Here, Sun Tzu brings the two sides together, the economic burden of mobilizing an army before it goes to war and the continuing cost of sustaining that army after it has been deployed. Once again, he emphasizes how deeply war can drain both the economy of the state and the livelihoods of its people. But the consequences do not end there. Sun Tzu writes, "This is where Sun Tzu explains what can happen after the economic damage has already been done. If an army remains in the field for too long, draining the state's finances and exhausting its resources, other states may see that weakness and move to take advantage of it. And once the situation reaches that point, the consequences may become impossible to control. So the financial crisis and economic damage caused by war are not merely economic problems. If allowed to develop far enough, they can become a threat to the survival of the state itself. So now we arrive at the central problem. War requires enormous quantities of supplies. An army needs food, equipment, transportation, and a continuous logistics network to keep it operating. But transporting those supplies over long distances and maintaining the supply lines needed to sustain an army is itself enormously expensive. And as we have just seen, if that burden continues for too long, the economic consequences can eventually threaten the survival of the state itself. So what can you do about it? Sun Tzu offers two solutions: forage on the enemy and speed is the essence of war. In the next episode, we will examine both of these solutions in detail. We will look at how Sun Tzu explains each approach, why neither should be understood in isolation, and ultimately, which one he considers the better solution to the economic and logistical costs of war. And most importantly, we will see how that final solution connects waging war to the broader strategic logic of the art of war as a whole. See you next episode.